So, May the 24th. 35 years ago to this day was the penultimate day in Sport Aid and Run the World. So you can imagine it was a pretty busy one. But for me, it was also a very special one because, we had a lot to do, but it was the day I went to Buckingham Palace. And probably the first time, actually, for a very, very long time, I'd actually stepped outside of the office. So it was really quite strange to kind of sense the mood of the public for the very first time. I mean, I had to go to Buckingham Palace via Virgin Megastore in Oxford Street, pretty much because I had to pick up some T-shirts. I wanted to give one to Princess Diana and one to Prince Charles. And so I kind of fought my way through traffic, managed to get to the Virgin Megastore. We had Sting there on the day, who was signing autographs and handing out T-shirts and application forms for the race in Hyde Park. So I picked up the shirts, jumped in the car, and then we headed off to Buckingham Palace with some guys from UNICEF UK. And when we arrived there were crowds everywhere. And my first thought was, we'd picked a bad day because it must be changing of the guard or something. But I was quickly reminded by Robert Smith, who was the head of the UK committee for UNICEF, saying no, they're here for us. They're here for Sport Aid, and it was an amazing feeling. And as we entered the gates of Buckingham Palace, I remember cameras flashing everywhere and thinking, my God, this is really happening. But once inside, I met Diana and Charles for the first time, and they were great. I mean, really well. I thought Diana was really funny. I handed them both a T-shirt, and I said to them, look, if you can't make it to the Hyde Park race tomorrow, then run around your garden and just get your mum and dad to sponsor you. And Diana thought that was quite funny, I must admit. And we walked outside to receive Omar, who had literally run through the streets of Europe in the preceding week, meeting heads of state and policymakers. And today it was his turn to deliver the torch of Africa to the United Kingdom, and to receive that were the Royal Highnesses. So it was a very moving moment, and I stood to one side as they did their bit with Omar, and it was a really special moment. And all of a sudden my phone rang. I had a mobile phone that was literally the size of a brick, and it sat on top of the box, which was the battery, almost the same size, and it hung off my shoulder like a lead weight, and suddenly it rang, and I picked up the phone, and it was my race organiser from Hyde Park, a guy called Will Chapman, who had been responsible for organising a lot of the races in the United Kingdom. An amazing race organiser. And he was on the phone. He sounded a bit worried, and I said, what's the matter, Will? He said, we can't put up the start and finish banners in Hyde Park. I said, why? What do you mean we can't put them up? He said, well, apparently you were told that we can't advertise in a Royal Park, and the start and finish banners have got British Airways on them. And I thought, you must be joking me. I said, look, it's not Canon, it's not Fuji, it's British Airways, for Christ's sake. I mean, at which point he said to me, look, you're on a speakerphone with the Royal Bailiff here, so what's your language? So anyway, I had a long conversation with the Royal Bailiff, but he stuck by his guns, and he said, look, I'm sorry, mate, but, we didn't say mate, but he said, I'm sorry, Mr. Long, you can't do it. It's against Royal Protocol, you cannot advertise in a Royal Park. So I got a bit stroppy and said, I need to speak to your boss. Who is it? And it was right then I thought to myself, hang on, I know his bosses. And I shouted out, I think I shouted Charles or Charlie or oi you or excuse me, your Royal Highness. I honestly can't remember what it was I shouted, but Charles and his private secretary walked over, and I said to him, look, we've got a problem with one of your gardens. And explained the problem, and that it's British Airways and not Honda or Fuji or Canon or a foreign advertiser. It's British Airways, And here we are with a British-made event helping to save the starving millions in Africa. And could common sense prevail, please? And he turned to his private secretary and he looked back at me and said, His Royal Highness will look into this. At which point, I picked up my phone to Will and said, Will, did you hear that? He said, what's that? I said, I just had a word with Charles, and he says, the banners stay up, mate. It was really funny. It was actually the lead item on the 6 o'clock news that night, and the banners stayed up. But we left Buckingham Palace on a coach, because a lot of the production crew for the US event and myself, Simon, a few others had to travel with Omar that night over to New York, and British Airways had given us Concorde for that leg. So we all arrived at Heathrow and it was buzzing. I mean, there was paparazzi and press everywhere, cameras and flashes going off. And we had to push our way through the crowds and make our way into the inner sanctum of the airport, where there was a private room set up where we would meet Bob. We were meeting Vangelis and a few other people there. And we walked in and Bob walked in, and there was a little bit of almost like a pregnant silence, pregnant pause. And he looked at me and said, I'm not coming. And I looked at Simon and went, what? I said, what do you mean? He said, I'm not coming. He said, look, Hands Across America is going to be big. New York race isn't going to be very big. This is where it's happening. The vibe's here. I'm staying in London. And I remember thinking, Bob, you should be in New York. That's where you should be. You should be delivering the torch of Africa to the United Nations and passing over the responsibility to the governments of the world. That's how we set this whole thing up. That's how it was designed, exactly for that purpose. This was going to be your swan song. He said, I'm not going. He said, this is where the vibe is. I'm staying in London. And I was flabbergasted. I was absolutely amazed. In fact, so much so I couldn't even say anything. I couldn't call him a wanker or anything. I just walked out the door and slammed it behind me. And when I took my seat on Concorde, I was still trying to compute what had happened. I just couldn't believe it. I couldn't understand why. I know during the week he hadn't been well, or that was the press story anyway, because he said he had tonsillitis or something. But then why not just say, I don't feel well, mate. I'm sorry. I feel crap. I'm going to stay in London. But to use an excuse of Hands Across America, and I just didn't get it. Anyway, we got on Concorde and we took off. And it was a great experience, because I'd never, ever, ever in my whole life would I have dreamed of flying on Concorde. And, oh man, we hit the Mach 2, twice the speed of sound. Omar was walking up and down the fuselage with the Sport A flame and a miner's lamp rocking beside him. And all the team, all our staff members who were coming on the flight, they were having a ball. It was a treat for them, and they really, really deserved it. And it was incredible. And I thought to myself, well, what the hell? I'm never, ever going to do this ever again. So I'm going to ask if I can go up front. So I had a word with stewardess as she passed, and I said, would you mind if I went and had a look in the cockpit? And she said, well, I will check with the captain and come back to you. And she did, and said, yep. She said, of course you can. So I wandered up front and walked into the cockpit. It was quite small and cramped, and there was the pilot and the co-pilot, some guy sitting to the right up against a big board of lights and levers and stuff. And it looked very complicated, but he offered me his seat, and I sat down and started asking loads of questions. I must have sounded like a complete pain in the arse. But at one point I said to the captain, I said, what time, and that's right, I said, what are you guys doing tomorrow? At 11 o'clock, which was the time the race started from New York, Eastern Standard Time. And he said, we'll be back at JFK doing our pre-flight checks. He said, we're flying back at 1 o'clock. I said, do me a favour, will you fly this thing over the top of the United Nations tomorrow? I said, it'd be an absolute buzz. Can you imagine it? Just as we're starting the race, if you flew over the top of the UN, maybe do a victory roll or something. Anyway, he laughed and said, unfortunately, he didn't have the authority to make that sort of decision. So I said, well, who does? And he said, well, Colin Marshall might. and Colin Marshall was on the plane. So I went and sat down by the side of Colin Marshall, who became Sir Colin Marshall the following year. I like to think that what he did next maybe contributed to that, but who knows. But anyway, I said, Colin, just been speaking with the guys up front. They'd like to fly this thing over the UN tomorrow at 11 o'clock. I said, that's a great idea. And he looked at me and almost with exasperation, as if to say, God, have we done enough for you? I said, Colin, imagine. I said, we've got 1.5 billion people watching this program tomorrow, and they're all going to be watching at the United Nations or looking at the United Nations at exactly 11 o'clock at the start of the race. I said, where do you think the cameras are going to point if Concorde comes flying over the top at 600 feet? And he looked again, and I went, I'll leave it with you then. And, well, you never know. If you don't ask, you don't get. And, well, we'll have to wait and see what happens.